Hi, I'm Matt Rizzetta, the founder and CEO of N6A, and this is a special virtual edition of our monthly Outcomes and Omelettes Thought Leadership Series. And it's a real treat to have Mike White with us today. Mike's been a great mentor and friend for many years and has so many great insights and perspectives on leadership, management, ethics, and so many things that are more important now in these unprecedented times than ever before. Mike, thanks again for coming on today. Really appreciate your time.
Delighted to be with you virtually, Matt. It's nice weather down here in Florida. I don't know about the rest of the country.
It's about 42 and borderline snowing up in the Northeast.
Yeah, well, it's 82 plus here, so.
Yeah. Hey, so Mike, I appreciate your time. Even though you can't see them out there, our entire N6A staff is watching this virtually on Zoom. We also have a bunch of attendees who've signed up for this and have dialed in from many cities across the country. I know everyone's looking forward to this conversation and to learning a lot from you on this call, in this chat. Before we get into the conversation, first, let me just kind of introduce our audience to our special guest. So Mike White is the former CEO of DirecTV. He led DirecTV during one of the most transformative periods in the history, really, of content and media from 2010 through 2015. Prior to serving as CEO of DirecTV, Mike had an illustrious career at PepsiCo, where he worked there for 20 years, about ultimately becoming PepsiCo's chief financial officer. Mike has also held leadership positions with Avon. He started his career at Bain Capital after completing his undergraduate studies at Boston College and receiving his master's in international relations from Johns Hopkins, if I got all that right, Mike. Today, Mike sits on the board of many prestigious companies and nonprofits, including Bank of America, Kimberly-Clark, and several others. And Mike, it's a real treat to have you here today. You know the respect and admiration that I have for you, and we really appreciate your time. And why don't we dive right into the discussion?
Great, happy to be here.
So Mike, let's kind of get kicked off, obviously, with, I'm curious to get your perspective just on the current environment, which is unprecedented in many regards. You've led big companies, huge global companies during major global crises in the past. We talked about SARS and 9/11. Can you just sort of share your perspectives on the current market conditions and compare that to previous crises and pandemics that you've been a part of?
Sure. The first big crisis was probably 1997 when the Pepsi International business was imploding. I was in charge of what was called the emergency room, so the restructurings that had to go on for bottlers. At the time, we took a $600 million write-off, which was a big number, and I thought that was kind of a real school for me, learning from folks like Craig Weatherup about leadership. And then I was running all of international for Pepsi during SARS in 2003, and I remember kind of 11 p.m. Phone calls with China every night. We had our HR team on, but 2 months after that, it was gone. And I thought I knew something about pandemics. Well, I didn't know anything about pandemics. I mean, in hindsight, I realized how naive we all were in what could happen. And I have to say, I mean, I've lived through 08, 09 and the financial crisis, but the pandemic here is like nothing I've seen in my career or in my lifetime. And I'm afraid we're only in the 5th mile of a 26-mile marathon. We're a little further on in some areas, like the medical aspect. The economic aspect, we're probably in the 3rd mile. And I'm afraid the economic fallout is going to be quite a bit more severe and elongated than folks currently would understand. So I think it's quite a challenging environment to try to navigate through. I'm privileged. I sit on 3 boards of directors, Bank of America, Kimberly-Clark, and Whirlpool, and all 3 have world-class CEOs that are steering the ship in these tough times. And so I've got my own experience and my passion about leadership in general to draw on, but I'm also fortunate to see 3 companies really doing, I think, a terrific job in their own way each in trying to navigate the COVID-19 pandemic.
And Mike, is there, just speaking of some of the companies, BOA and Kimberly-Clark and Whirlpool, where you sit on their boards. Are there any specific examples that you've seen from leadership over there that we could learn from?
Well, I think there are a few things in common. I mean, each of them very quickly, I mean, and it's no different. I've always thought of leadership as, the art of setting an agenda. It's how you bring people with you, and it's, doing it the right way. And, each of them in their own way has had to quickly set an agenda. I think in the case of Whirlpool, the agenda was kind of two parts. One was, what do we need to do immediately? And that was kind of separated into several buckets. Kind of employee safety was one, supply chain was a second one, finance was a third one, and liquidity issues, cash management, issues on that front. And at the same time, longer term, we're looking at opportunities. What we're going to be in a different world even when this is over.
Right.
And so, is whether it's going faster on the digital agenda or social media or whatever, on that front. So, but it's starts with, being clear about your agenda or the buckets of work or areas of focus. Each has had to do similar things. I mean, Bank of America is a little different. They're just trying to process, I forget how many, almost 500,000 applications and 1 million requests for deferments. And I mean, it's apart from having 150,000 people work from home, and they had to come up with 90,000 laptops to equip them so that it'd be secure. So, I think getting that agenda right, there's no doubt in a crisis, I hate to say it, but you're going to play 70% defense and only 30% offense. And I've always said, look, you have to play a lot more defense. You're protecting your liquidity and things like that. At the same time, at least save 30% of your time to think about the future and try and anticipate what's going to be different on that front. I think on the taking people with you piece of it, Matt, how you lead in a crisis, in my view, is a little bit different. And I think, on the one hand, you got to have a lot of confidence. I call it realistic optimism, but people want to know the truth. So, getting the balance right between kind of giving hope, which is the job of leadership in some ways, and being optimistic and positive. At the same time, I think you cannot afford to not be incredibly realistic. Sometimes I'd say plan for the worst and hope for the best. Agreed. But getting that balance right, I think, is critical in how you bring people along. And without a doubt, I mean, you're in the communications field. Communications. And, and it's everything from the consistency of the messaging that comes out, the frequency of communication, the multiple channels you need to communicate. You can't take anything for granted. You got to be working multiple channels. At Whirlpool, I think they're using Everbridge so that in an emergency, you can contact any given employee at any given time. They're doing other things with dashboards and websites and having the CEO kind of do a Google chat. They do a lot with Google Meets because of no offense, the hack problems with Zoom. Yeah. Most of the businesses have stayed away from Zoom for that reason, just because their security is not good. But it's also listening. I mean, in a crisis like this, one of the challenges for leadership is leadership at 100,000 feet is useless. Okay, you can't operate that way. You got to get your fingers dirty. You better know how things really work or don't work. If you want to talk about testing and COVID-19, it's not a particularly helpful conversation that says we don't have enough, we have plenty. Yeah. Because actually it's quite a complex subject, and it's frustrating when you get into the supply chain and the details. But as a leader, you got to get the question right. Yeah. And you got to make sure that you're digging deep enough that you really understand what's working or what's not working, because you can't take it for granted in these things, especially in an environment like this where we're in uncharted waters. I mean, no one's gone through this. China is a whole different phenomenon because they can shut the country down, kind of doesn't matter in some ways, and they don't have the interconnections that we would have in this country. So it's quite a different experience here, nor do they have the healthcare system we have. So, I mean, it's just, and there's going to be so many unintended side effects or collateral damage that you haven't even thought of. I mean, I just yesterday, I'm on the advisory board for Johns Hopkins University for their Graduate School of International Relations, because I got my graduate degree there. I'm also on the Boston College Board of Trustees. But Johns Hopkins, the president has set out a note now that said they're going to lose $100 million in the fiscal year ending June and $350 million next fiscal year if they don't do some things differently. So they're having to make radical choices, tough choices that higher ed has never had to deal with before.
Yeah.
And that's just one example. Think of the revenues for the New York subway system. I mean, I'm telling you, we're going to be digging out of this hole for years. Okay. I mean, it's a very complex environment. No matter whether you like Trump or you like Cuomo, I don't care. They're both doing the best they can in uncharted waters. Their styles are quite different. I'm not a fan of the Donald style, but the substance is more or less the same. And it's a really difficult balancing act because there, in a lot of ways, there aren't good answers. You know, and I think that's one of the tough challenges of this particular environment. And the last thing I would say about doing it the right way, I mean, obviously it starts with integrity, but I always had a boss who said, Mike, they don't care what you know until they know you care. So I think it always starts with empathy, especially from a communication standpoint. You know, you got a lot of people that are hurting in ways you might not realize. And I think, you know, understanding that is really important. I mean, I don't have a conversation with someone where I'm not asking a lot of questions.
Agreed.
I happen to have a niece who's in the intensive care unit at Beth Israel Hospital in Boston with 40 patients on ventilators. She's a nurse, and she's doing the intubations, okay? And I have a friend who lives in Singapore who called me yesterday and said, we just had to lock Singapore down again because the virus is back. It went away and came back. So I get a lot of information. But I would say for everybody else on the call that might not be CEO, you know what? This isn't a time just for leadership on CEOs. Everybody should have a leadership mindset. And I think the leadership mindset is be positive. We will get through this. I mean, it's not like curing Alzheimer's. I mean, we will get a vaccine. We're going to get drug therapies. It's just going to take some time. And I'm very optimistic about our economy long term. We're still the most dynamic economy in the world by far, with the most innovative, creative folks, you know, anywhere. So I'm very optimistic in the long run, but the short run is going to be really tough. And you can't, as a leader, just, you know, say, oh, everything's going to be fine. You actually, and as I say, Ron Daniels, a terrific university president at Johns Hopkins. You know, you read his letter to the university, and it's about building it around the values of the university. The actions they're taking are grounded in all those kind of principles and values. I mean, I think he did a really good job on it. But it's also a great time to learn. I mean, be a lifelong learner, because this is a once-in-a-lifetime event for folks to learn on almost any front, whether it's what works communication-wise, what doesn't work, what works from a leadership style. I mean, it's just, this is an unprecedented thing in my career. And I think that it requires leadership from the bottom of the organization to the top.
Yeah, agreed.
And, you know, I mean, there are other things Bank of America's done things on benefits. They loosened up the childcare where if you have a uncle or a cousin who can babysit your kids, you're going to get $200 a month if you're making less than $100,000 a year. I mean, you have to think about the front line and what you need to do for them to make them safe. But it's also clear to me, Matt, and I'll wrap up here, that this is not going to be over in a week or a month. And you know what? Whether we reopen the economy the 1st of May, the 15th of May, the 1st of June, or the 1st of July, it doesn't matter. I hate to say it. I mean, it might matter on the margin, but the truth of it is, even if you opened it the 1st of July, you're still going to have to learn to live with COVID.
Right.
It's not going away.
Yeah.
I mean, if we all thought staying closed till the 1st of July would mean it's gone for good, we'd all stay closed till July. But unfortunately, everything we know about this thing is you're going to be living with it for the next couple of years until there's really a vaccine. And to scale a vaccine, it's at least 18 months out. And that'll be a record, by the way. The average vaccine takes 7 to 10 years to do. So, I think everybody's working on stuff. We will make progress, but for those that are in business, I'm telling them now, the most important thing for you to start thinking about is how are you going to reopen? Whether it'll be gradual and so on and so forth. And some businesses will be easier than others, because if you're in the cruise ship business, like a friend of mine, who's the CEO of Carnival Cruises, man, I'm not going on a cruise ship anytime soon.
Right.
And, I think hotels, travel, entertainment, sports, some of those, concerts and nonprofits like symphonies and whatever, I don't see people doing that stuff for the rest of this calendar year. And then we'll see.
Yeah, agreed. Mike, I want to touch on communication again, because you hit on that earlier. I think it's a super important topic. And by the way, I totally agree with you. And a lot of what we've been talking to our staff about is, just being as transparent as we possibly can. This obviously is unprecedented, so there is no playbook, that we could just pick up off the shelf and follow, which is sort of what you hit on earlier. My question for you as a corporate leader would be, when you think about communication in this environment, how do you balance those two things where you need to be very transparent upfront, you need to lean on empathy and candor, like you said, but you also need to keep morale high. You don't want to be demoralizing in any way. How do you kind of think about that in terms of practicing communication and walking that line without crossing over one end or the other?
Everybody's got a different style. Okay. Mine, and you got to remember, I was working in some pretty high performance organizations, PepsiCo, even DirecTV, before that, Anderson Consulting, what's today Accenture and Bain. I mean, these are all high performing organizations. So you don't really have to, you're motivating thoroughbreds to a certain extent. So it's different than managing the post office or something in that sense. So my style, but also my style was always to be pretty candid. I mean, I don't want, look, there are always things you're not going to talk about. Don't tell them everything that's on your mind. Okay. But I always felt I would err on the side of being, people can deal with the truth if they know it.
Agreed.
I mean, the biggest frustration folks have today is the lack of control. But you know what? That's reality. Okay. So I think being as transparent as you can, I think being authentic matters. I mean, people, trust is really important, and it's easy to lose it. And so, in this kind of environment, do you have my back? Leave no one behind. I mean, how do I know? Well, Brian Moynihan, CEO of Bank of America, has done so much for the front line. First thing they said is no layoffs this year. And second was, if you have a pre-existing condition and you work in a branch, stay home. Mm-hmm. Keep your job, we'll pay you, or we'll find you something else to do, but we're not going to jeopardize your health. So, I mean, it's it when you see it. It's about values. But I think from a communication standpoint, it is clarity matters. And I think, again, it's a good example where sometimes these discussions drive me nuts with the politics that goes on, because the honest to God truth is, it isn't about how many states are ready to open or not ready to open, or whether, North Dakota or South Dakota does X, Y, or Z. It isn't going to make a whit's worth of difference in New York City. Okay.
Yeah, that's true.
Because even New York is two very different states between upstate and Manhattan and the issues. Yeah. And Michigan, I mean, Detroit is really different than the rest of Michigan. So every state has got parts of the state that you probably ought to get ready to reopen. And it's got other parts of the state that you're going to have to do some real thinking on as to what you ought to do, where, and when. And so it doesn't help anybody to have these kind of conversations at too high a level. You got to get into the details and figure out how you're going to think about stuff. And that's why I said, getting into the details, devil's in the details on these things, and getting the right questions. Because, as I said, the other issue is with the economic damage that's being done, you might not have an economy to come back to if you keep it closed too long.
It's true.
So but I think the consistency of your messaging, the frequency of your messaging, and I think that all three CEOs, Mike Hsu at Kimberly-Clark, Mark Bitzer at Whirlpool, and Brian Moynihan at Bank of America, they're all kind of similar in style in that they're very authentic leaders that are positive, energizing, and can do, but they always put the team first. I mean, Brian's the last person in the world to use the word I. You know, it's we, and it's about teammates, and his actions show that too, by the way. You can't fake stuff in this environment.
Yeah.
But I think from a communication standpoint, and I think you have to be as multidimensional too, Matt. I mean, this is an environment, as you know, where you need to be thinking about what you're doing with print, what you're doing with your customers, what you're doing with your employees, and you got to have multimedia on all of these fronts in ways that are unprecedented. So if you didn't have a digital agenda before,
you need one now.
You better get one now, because I mean, and this is an opportunity in my mind. I mean, look at the schools. What a horrible job being prepared for this. I mean, at least the universities were fairly quick to pivot to online learning. The schools in the Boston area are terrible at it. And I'd say that's an enormous opportunity, because, now you can't pretend you've never seen a pandemic now.
Right.
So, kind of, how does this accelerate your digital agenda? We've seen it, by the way, at Whirlpool, where our D2C sales, direct to consumer sales, are way up through the website. And so how does that change things as you start to think about your distribution strategy when you come out of this? So I think, the digital agenda matters. The other thing I'd say, Matt, is, Craig Witheritt always said, I want the team to commit head, heart, and hands. So how are you coming at each of those three? The head piece is the intellectual part of convincing people that you've looked at it, you've analyzed the facts, and you got a good plan. The heart piece is empathy and getting people passionate and energized about the future. And the hands thing is being practical.
I like that. Mike, let me ask you about that real quick. Just, turn the page quickly to, we're talking about leadership in times of crises. You've ran companies that have had a huge impact on the global, economic market, the global consumer. So I wanted to get your perspectives on sort of the brand piece of this. Obviously, you sit on boards now of brands that have, major economic impact across the world. If you're in the driver's seat and you're in a leadership position right now running a global company, how are you thinking about your brand when it comes to how you're projecting that brand externally without coming across opportunistic, because that word opportunism, is kind of something that's very scary as well. So how do you think about that, where you're using your brand to be a public aid to help the world really get through this, but you're doing it in a way where it doesn't ever come across like it's opportunistic?
Yeah, I think that Kimberly-Clark's got some pretty good ads on right now about, what is it, save a sheet or something of toilet paper, whatever, that I think are very, look, you can't make it artificial. So if you've got something to say, it needs to people need to not look at it as just about the brand, right? Or it won't matter. I mean, all of us are, by the way, cutting back advertising, because in a lot of cases, if stores are closed, there's no sense throwing advertising out there dollar-wise. So don't get me wrong, you're cutting some ads. On the other hand, I would say it's also as much about reputation. Mm-hmm. And in my mind, the value, I hate to say it, Matt, but you can't put your candle under a lampshade in these times. So, I mean, Kimberly-Clark was doing some stuff for hospitals where we had converted some of the plants to make, I think it was a certain kind of protective gear. It was either masks or the other stuff, the robe stuff. And, and they just were doing it for 3 local hospitals. And I said, well, but guys, you need to put that on your website, because I'm a big believer, by the time you need friends, if you haven't built them, and a lot of people are very critical of businesses, whether it's on climate change or whatever, so you really do have to, you have to make sure your message gets out there. And yet, if you broadcast it too loud, you won't get credit. So, and it's got to be, what's the word? Cohesive. I mean, it's got to be in line with what people would think about your company. So, I mean, Moynihan was saying yesterday, they've come up now, I think they've got 4 million face masks they've been able to source out of China with Apple. And they hadn't said anything yet because they want to make sure they got them here. So first they got them at the airport in Indianapolis here. They'd landed, they'll go to FEMA, but they want to check the quality before they, kind of put that out there.
Right.
But I think you do have to talk about your values, and reputation matters. So I don't know of a company, PepsiCo, Kimberly, Whirlpool, Bank of America, they've all got stuff they're doing for the community as part of this. And so I think that's important, because in a time like this, look, by the way, it goes the other way too. I mean, Bank of America learned the hard way in 2008 and 9. Right. When you are kind of throwing your existing customers, your mortgage customers, out of their homes, that takes years to dig out of that reputation hole. And so how you use your corporate citizenship agenda, I think, matters in this kind of an environment. But it's also, in my mind, no offense, Bernie Sanders is so full of nonsense. I mean, if you look at what companies are doing in giving back, I mean, and by the way, if we're going to get out of this mess, it's going to be the private sector,
the corporations,
to a great extent, both healthcare, research, drugs, you name it. But I think it is, you can't fake it again. It's as much what's your reputation, and what are the things that you do that you believe in that you ought to be giving back to the community as part of your agenda. And every one of the 3 companies I know are doing that. But I do think it's not something you should hide. But if you're just going to go blast ads about that, you won't get credit. I mean, I think the Kimberly ad is I think it's Save a Sheet or something, is a pretty good example of one that's relevant, and I think they get credit for what they're doing.
Yeah, I agree. Mike, I don't know, our experience with clients, we've been advising them in terms of how they think about their brand externally to follow 3 principles. It's classy, operate with high integrity and use this as an opportunity to show the world the integrity of your brand. 2 is smart, lean on your brains and your intellect to outsmart the competition. And then 3, and I think this is getting overlooked right now, is fast. I think speed to market in this environment is super important. And I can just tell you from a very kind of quick case study we've done studying a handful of brands since the pandemic began, that has yet to fail any of them. So it's very similar and seems aligned with what you were talking about, some of the companies that you sit on the board and whatnot of.
No, this is so dynamic, Matt. I mean, I'm on the board of governors for my country club, and I remember when it was first starting, and they were trying to cut back the golf course. We'll keep it open, but not this and not that. We'll close the clubhouse. And on Friday, he called me for advice, and I said, boy, that seems appropriately tough. Yeah. In terms of what you're closing. By Saturday morning, I called him back and said, you know what? It's not tough enough. And that was not even 24 hours later.
Yeah, okay? It's so fluid.
It's such a dynamic environment. Bank of America is watching liquidity by the hour. Now, they're in good shape, but they learned the hard way in the crisis of 08 and 09. Liquidity is everything. You got to have enough liquidity, firepower, cash to get you through to the other side, because otherwise you don't have anything to come back to. But I think you're right.
That's a good point too. I wanted to ask you, how does your role as a board member at these huge global companies kind of change in an environment like this, just in terms of process and frequency of meetings and just sort of the regularity of your communications? I'm assuming it's a totally different environment that you're operating in as a board member just like it is for the companies, for whom you're representing?
Well, sure. A typical board meets 6 times a year, 5, 6 times a year in a normal environment. In this environment, oh goodness, we're hearing from the CEO once a week, at least, and sometimes more than once a week. If things are changing now, it tends to be more about, here's a memo from Brian Moynihan, and he attaches 25 pages of what they're doing on their own employee health and safety, what they're doing on liquidity and capital. So there's a couple of buckets that go with it. Mm-hmm. But all 3 CEOs are communicating with the board, I'd say almost weekly. Now, it may move back to once every 2 weeks. It somewhat depends on how dynamic the situation is. But no, first of all, you're going to get more frequent communications, and it's all digital now anyway, on your iPad, and phone calls. So, it's a combination of that, number one. Number two, I find CEOs want, they want advice. Hey, Mike, can I just pick your brain for an hour? So you kind of get more engaged in just being a sounding board for an uncharted crisis that they've never seen, perhaps. And I think the third thing is it's about focus.
Right.
I think a board needs to, on the one hand, make sure, that we're focusing most of our time on the pandemic, because that is the most important issue right now to customers, to government. You can't get airtime for anything else. At the same time, part of that is save 30% to talk about your offensive opportunities and what you're doing to make a difference. And I think if you're a board, obviously you want to make sure you're, for us, one of the challenges, since I chair 2 audit committees and I'm on the 3rd audit committee, is ensuring that the internal controls in a work from home kind of model are as robust as they need to be for financial reporting, and disclosures are also different. So, it's much more real time than the 6 meetings a year, and you don't often hear between the 6 meetings. You could
Right.
go 2 months and not hear anything, so that's different.
Yeah. Mike, we have a bunch of questions, by the way, from the staff, which if you have 10 minutes or so, I'd love to get into a few of these. Any ones that
Sure.
answer, I promise our staff, I'll figure out a way to get them answered.
Sure.
Mike, I had one question just I wanted to hit on before we got into the staff Q&A, which you talked about the virtual workplace. I'm just curious to get sort of your POV on what, the future of the workplace looks like when the world comes back to normal. And, now we're so used to operating in this virtual workplace with video conferences and whatnot. What's sort of the lingering long-term effect, if any, of that as far as how the workplace is going to be changed?
I think there will, Matt, but I still think we got a lot to learn. The video and telephonic meetings are not ideal. They're hard to keep your attention span. They're hard to do discussion, no matter how hard you try. I know that from having been on them. So on the other hand, I don't think we're just going to go back to the old way. I think people are going to think differently about office space. I've got a nephew who's at Boston College and he's doing the online learning. I said, how's it going? And he had the same, well, it's okay, but it's not the same as being in class. So I think that there's a productivity opportunity and watch out. You're less productive in some ways because it's I know myself, I'm reluctant to ask a question unless I feel really strongly about it on a telephonic board call because I can't see who else is there.
Yeah, can't read body language.
No. Now, if it's an important question, I'll ask it. Don't get me wrong, but I'll be a little more reluctant.
Yeah.
So I think that, and Zoom obviously has to fix their privacy and security issues big time. I think they booted that, and I'm sure they will, but I think it will be different. I think we will see a different workplace and people thinking differently about who has to be physically present in the workplace going forward.
Agreed. So, Mike, we have about 15 questions here. I think we'll only have time for about 3 or 4, but these are from our staff. The first one comes from Danielle Montana, who runs strategic accounts for N6A. Her question is, you were the leader of DirecTV through a transformative period for content and media in general. What was it like leading a content company during that period in time, Mike?
Well, DirecTV was more of a distribution company than a content company. I mean, the only content, we did a couple of sports shows, and we had a channel that we programmed, but I was never naive enough to think we were Disney. We weren't. And so but I think it was, even as a distribution company, the world was changing. Every minute. Talk about speed. I was rebooting the strategy, and I used to think a strategy is good for 5 years. I was rebooting the strategy sometimes twice a year.
Yeah.
In terms of, well, first we're going to go work on TV everywhere. No, now we got to go work on a Netflix equivalent or this. And it was changing so fast that you had to make sure you were looking around the corner, as Gretzky said, skating to where the puck's going to be, and being willing to pivot, as fast as you have to. So it was quite interesting because people forget how fast everything happened. The iPad was like 2008. We were still sending red envelopes, or Netflix was, when I got to DirecTV in 2010.
Right.
But 2012, it was a whole different game.
Yeah.
And I think, it's not done yet. It's really in a rapid state of change.
Yeah. Mike, this one comes from our Chief of Staff, John Hanaway. He wants to know, so you negotiated one of the biggest M&A transactions in really the history of the U.S. economy, global economy, with AT&T when you were the CEO of DirecTV. The topic of stress management is at the heart of this question. How did you manage to handle the pressures and stresses that come with that? And how could some of those learnings help our employees in this environment? Yeah,
I think that, by the way, Matt, you could probably group that with negotiating with the NFL, because that was probably even more stressful, to be honest with you. When you're negotiating with Goodell and Kraft, they're not easy to negotiate with, especially since they're holding all aces and, you've got a two of clubs.
Yes.
But the same with AT&T, particularly when we didn't know if we'd get it approved by the regulators. So, you got to keep the team together and keep them focused. So I'll get to the stress point, but I think it starts with continuing to keep people focused on driving the business, because it isn't a done deal until it's a done deal. I would say, in terms of stress, and I think this is important today. I said this to my niece, the one who's working in the ICU, and we were talking about it, and she said, when I'm going to work every day, I don't have time to worry. I'm so busy, because those machines are complicated, the ventilators, and you got to be on 20. You're just on every second. But it's when you go home at night to your apartment, and that's when she would get emotional, thinking about having lost a couple patients or having had to bring the iPad so they could say goodbye and stuff. And I just said to her, you've got to find ways to stay centered yourself. The old airline phrase, if the oxygen masks come down, put it on yourself first and then put it on your child. You got to have self-care. And there's lots of ways to stay centered. It could be going for a walk. It could be exercising or going for a run. I would say, for some people it's yoga or Pilates. There's just breathing. The old take 10 seconds to breathe in, 10 seconds to breathe out, and pretend you're breathing out a frozen rope. And you do that 5 times, and, it'll just recenter you and your mindset. For some people, it's meditation. For me, I had a bunch of things I would do to try to sometimes I just got to go for a walk and clear my head. If I was in a tough meeting, which I was more with the NFL than with Randall, I would say, I would put my watch on my right wrist instead of my left, which I'm left-handed. And it would just be enough to kind of get you slow down.
Yeah.
Just breathe, take it slow. Don't rush. Speed kills in these situations. So, I think it is making sure that you're also nurturing relationships, because you actually have to work a little harder at it. I think, and that's an important part of staying centered or balanced and managing stress is that, because most people, I mean, I played goalie in college, the second the puck drops, you're concentrated and you're so focused. I'm not worried about managing stress.
Right.
But it's, how do you make sure you don't second guess yourself? Because that doesn't help anybody. I mean, I'm a big believer you're going to make mistakes in these environments because these are all uncharted waters. I mean, heck, Lincoln went through 7 generals before he got to Grant.
Yes.
Okay. I mean, and if you go back and look at the disaster that it was the first 2 or 3 years, and World War II was the same, except the generals part of it. I mean, we didn't do well for about 2.5 years.
For a while. Yeah.
But we ramped it up and then we did. So, I think you got to give yourself a break and recognize you're doing the best you can. The biggest mistake you make is just not pivoting fast enough if things are changing or they're not working.
Amen, Mike. Thanks for that. This next question comes from Gabrielle Raitano, who's one of our great teammates based out of our New York office. Gabrielle wants to know, Mike, what's the biggest challenge you faced in your career and how were you able to overcome it?
I don't know, probably in my, my son was, it wasn't career so much, and my son got into drugs big time and, went through 4 rehabs before he eventually came out the other end. Fortunately did, and now he's a certified mental health counselor in Massachusetts and works for Chris Herron and the Herron Project and does a fabulous job. But there were times when I didn't know if he'd make it. And helping him, and again, I wouldn't say we were perfect as parents. We struggled trying to figure out what to do. But that was probably the toughest thing. From a career standpoint, I think it was learning better people skills around self-awareness and being street smart and savvy about organizational politics and how they work or don't work, and some of that stuff when I was at Frito-Lay in the early 1990s.
Wow. Mike, do you have time for one more question?
Sure.
This is from one of our virtual attendees, Anthony DeLillo. He said, Mike, earlier you spoke about values and ethics. Can you talk about how you would think about shareholder returns and optimizing P&Ls if you're a corporate leader in this environment? It's obviously such a delicate subject because as a CEO, you have a fiduciary responsibility to maximize shareholder returns. But in an environment like this, you also have the same responsibility for your employees. So how would you walk that balance?
I think it is a balance, Matt. And I think that anybody who thinks there's a formula for it, because every time the lawyers get involved and you try to say, all right, what percentage of this stakeholder versus this stakeholder? Look, we all know we work for the shareholders. And therefore, first and foremost is the survival of the enterprise. So liquidity, cash management, taking the steps you got to take, because we don't know how bad this is going to be. So cost we're all doing tough stuff on the cost front right now. Mm-hmm. All 3 businesses, but particularly Whirlpool is. You just can't take for granted that we're going to have a V-shaped recovery, because I don't think anybody believes that. I certainly don't.
Right.
It's not going to be that simple. There's going to be a lot of carnage, collateral damage and things that we haven't even thought about yet. So, I think as a board member, first and foremost, it's about the enterprise's, longevity and ensuring that you are taking the steps you take first and foremost. On the other hand, if you lose your employees' hearts and minds, you don't have an enterprise either in today's world. So, I think trying to artificially, just because employees don't want you to lay them off, you got to do what you got to do. You got to do the tough things, but you do it in a way where the values are right. Ron Daniels said, I'm cutting my pay 20%. He's the president of Johns Hopkins. Okay. We're not going to match your 401k for a year. That's a big deal. Save them $100 million. Okay. I mean, there are things like that, or Whirlpool's already said, we're going to give you stock instead of cash for your 401k. But the key is to grind in the communication, is to ground it in the principles that you're applying and the reason, because I think people can deal with the truth if they understand you're being straight with them. And I think as a board member, boy, your first obligation isn't just to the shareholders. It happens to be to your liquidity and your viability, and your balance sheet becomes really important. You got to have a fortress balance sheet to get through this stuff. We learned that the hard way in '08 on the Whirlpool board, where it was a near-death experience. So, I think you have to take the tough medicine as well. But I also think that you can't afford to lose the hearts and minds of your best folks that you're going to count on in the long run, because, as I said, this isn't curing Alzheimer's. We will get through this. And you want to make sure most organizations these days, I would say human capital is way more important than the physical capital that you have.
Absolutely.
And the same goes with consumers and their hearts and minds. So, you think about that franchise. I'm not a believer that you can sacrifice one for the other. I think, everybody, you have to think of what's best for the shareholders, but even the shareholder discussions in my mind they're not about, I got to deliver this EPS this quarter. I mean, I'm like, forget the quarter.
Yeah.
The quarter's a write-off. Okay. The real question is, how well are you positioned for the rest of this year?
That's right.
And then, and because nobody knows how quickly you're going to bounce back. So make sure that you're taking the cost out you need to take out, and you're prepared. And then hopefully you'll come back stronger next year.
Yeah. Amen. Mike, thank you so much. We really appreciate your time. I know you're a busy guy, and, I appreciate all you've done for me and for our company through the years. Your perspectives were tremendous. I know our staff and everyone watching this virtually appreciates all of your insights and got a lot of value from this. So thank you so much for doing this for us.
All right. Thanks, Matt. Everybody stay safe. Wash your hands.
Yeah. Same to you down in Florida. I hope to see you soon in a better environment.
I hope to be back up north sometime in the next couple months.
Awesome. I was doing my best.
Take care. Stay safe, everybody.
Same to you. Thanks, Mike.